So welcome to our third lecture, and in this lecture we will cover the basic unit of life, the cell, prokaryotic versus eukaryotic organisms, and then we will discuss viruses as well within this lecture. So first of all, we've talked about cells, and there are a few statements that in the biological sciences with regard to cells and living organisms. The first one is the cell is the basic unit of organization within an organism. So it's a basic building block of an organism. Whether it is a single-celled organism or whether it's a multicellular organism, they all consist of cells. So it's a basic unit of organization. All living organisms are composed of at least one cell, as we've discussed earlier. Then all cells arise by division of a previously existing cell. Cells don't just suddenly disappear. Cells are usually created through the division from other cells. So you have one mother cell, and this mother cell divides into two daughter cells. Whether this is during early development, where you have the egg and the sperm fuse, and then the egg, the zygote, the fertilized egg, then undergoes early cleavage stages, and you have two daughter cells. And as development then progresses, those cells now start to increasingly differentiate and specialize into different cells as gene expression is now turned on within these developing organisms. So whether you have this early development or whether you just have normal mitotic division during growth, where, for example, one liver cell gives rise to another identical liver cell, and this liver cell doesn't differentiate into another type of cell, but just forms another liver cell. So no matter what kind of division you have, these daughter cells are always obtained from a previously existing cell. Then life processes such as metabolism and heredity are seated within the cells. So all the metabolic machinery that is important to sustain life, that is important to sustain an organism or sustain tissue and the functionality of tissues, and also to create all of those molecules and proteins that are necessary to form this organism and to perform all of those metabolic processes, are seated within those cells. And they are seated depending on what kind of cell it is. In eukaryotic cells, the genetic material is seated within this nucleus that is surrounded by this nuclear envelope here. In prokaryotic organisms, we don't have a nuclear envelope per se, but we still have genetic material within those cells. And all of those other organelles that are important, for example, as these chloroplasts here, contain chlorophyll and important for the production of energy in plant cells. So all of those organelles, mitochondria, generation of ATP, very important for to maintain this organism. Then humans have over 200 different types of cells that are organized in different types of tissue. And depending on whether you're a single-celled organism or whether you're multicellular organisms, you have different hurdles to overcome. A single-celled organism, for example, doesn't need to develop lung tissue because the oxygen can easily diffuse into the single-celled organisms. If it is an aerobic organism that requires oxygen for its metabolic processes, then the oxygen can easily diffuse into this one cell. If you're a multicellular organism, diffusion won't work in order to supply all of the cells in this organism with oxygen. So for this reason, a multicellular organism now needs to develop specialized cell types, specialized tissues that then take on this special function in order to transport oxygen into the bloodstream and provide this oxygen to all of the cells throughout the entire body. And so there are numerous functions that particularly this, multicellular organisms are now required to have in order to successfully survive in their environments. So So you're familiar with this picture here where we look at the diversity of life. We have the eukaryotic and the prokaryotic organisms. The eukaryotic organisms that are the plants, the fungi, the animals, and the protists, the single-celled organisms. The prokaryotic organisms, which are comprised of the archaea and the bacteria. Again, the archaea are extremophiles that live in very harsh or very extreme, or that thrive in very extreme climates. What I have omitted from the previous picture is that besides the prokarya and the eukarya, there's also another form of, you see, and I don't know if I should call it life, because there's a discussion going on there, of structures that are comprised of proteins that are formed by living organisms. And these are the viruses. They have genetic material and they have proteins. And these are characteristic for living organisms. However, viruses don't fulfill many of the criteria for life. And for that reason, there's an ongoing discussion of whether viruses should be classified as living organisms or not. And in order to get this discussion going, I would like to give you a little bit of background with regard to prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms, and then discuss this in relation to viruses. So let's look at eukaryotic and prokaryotic organisms. If we look at the prokaryotic organisms, the bacteria and the archaea, then what we'll see here, this is an electron microscopic picture, a transmission electron microscopic image, where you can see this bacterial cell here. And if you compare this with a eukaryotic cell here, and these are neurons, this is nervous tissue that you see, you having cross sections through neurons here, through the axons and axon terminals of neurons. And what is striking in those pictures immediately is that you see all those cell organelles here. You can see cytoskeletal components here. You can't see this kind of detail in the prokaryotic organism because we don't have per se these membrane-bound organelles within this organism. And if we look at this in a little bit more detail, there's no nucleus as we see it in the eukaryotic organisms, like this nucleus that is surrounded by this nuclear envelope, by this nuclear membrane. We don't have that in prokaryotic organisms. They have a nucleoid in the center where the genetic material is in basically a circular structure, and that is arranged within the center of this cell. That has important implications for protein synthesis within those organisms, and we come back to this when we talk about protein synthesis, because here the protein does not have to be, or the information that encodes for the protein does not have to be transported out of the nuclear envelope as it has in eukaryotic organisms. For that reason, in prokaryotic organisms, proteins are synthesized where they are encoded in this area. In prokaryotic organisms, we don't have internal membrane systems, and as so often, there are exceptions, and these exceptions are actually very important bacteria. These are the cyanobacteria, which are believed to have contributed to the enrichment of our atmosphere with oxygen very early on. They are bacteria that have a very complex membrane structure inside of them, and within these membranes there are photosynthetic active molecules, and these bacteria undergo or perform photosynthesis, and a byproduct of this photosynthesis is oxygen. And it is believed that those cyanobacteria, and you see the membrane stacks here, are responsible for the enrichment of oxygen in our atmosphere early on in the history of life of this planet. There are no interior compartments in prokaryotic organisms. The cytoskeleton, they do have a cytoskeleton that is not unlike the eukaryotic cytoskeleton, but is not as rigid as the eukaryotic cytoskeleton. And we will come back when we talk about the cytoskeleton in eukaryotic and prokaryotic organisms. We'll come back to that. Then prokaryotic organisms very often have a very rigid cell wall. And this is because they are single-celled organisms, and depending on which kind of organism it is, they often live in harsh environments, and they need the cell wall in order to protect the genetic material and the inside, the protein machinery inside, from the environment. Then if we look at the eukaryotic organisms and now compare this with the prokaryotic organisms, what we'll see here is that eukarya, again, we have our nucleus that is surrounded by the nuclear envelope, and the genetic material is located within this nuclear envelope and very much compartmentalized. In order to now synthesize proteins, we need to transport the genetic material, the genetic information out of the nuclear envelope, unlike in prokaryotic organisms. Then we have an internal membrane system, and that becomes instantly apparent when you look at those different cells here. Here you have all these membranous structures. If you have mitochondria, what you see here, that are surrounded by membranes, you have vesicles that are surrounded by membranes, you have endoplasmic reticulum that is surrounded by membranes, Golgi apparatus, and a lot of different organelles that are within eukaryotic organisms, again, compartmentalized and surrounded by membranes. Then they have an extensive cytoskeleton, and you can see this in this picture here. These, for example, would be microtubules that stabilize cells, are important for transport of proteins and other molecules along the microtubules, so that it can transport, the cell can transport necessary proteins from one end of the cell to the other end of the cell. They have cell walls in the case of protists and plants, or sun protists and plants, and they have a cell membrane in the case of animal cells. So these are characteristics for prokarya and eukarya. Now, if we do see differences between prokarya compared to eukarya, but now if we compare this with a virus, now a virus looks very different. A virus is not a cell per se because it's not surrounded by a cell membrane. And it doesn't have all of those, this machinery that prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms have for protein synthesis, for metabolism, for reproduction. Viruses don't have that. They are basically a protein shell with genetic material, nucleic acids inside of them. And here you can see two examples. This is a bacteriophage that infects bacteria. And here we have the influenza virus that is, in this case here, surrounded by a membranous envelope. And you can see that on the outside of this envelope, they often have proteins that recognize certain receptors on the host cell, and for that reason can dock to this host cell, to this very specific host cell, and can then inject its genetic material into this host cell. This bacteriophage here, they usually use those fibers, these foot-looking or leg-looking fibers, like fibers, and dock on this on the bacteria that they infect, and then inject the genetic material inside of the host cell. But they don't really have all the other characteristics of life. So now if we compare viruses versus eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells, here we have our characteristics, here we have the virus, here we have the cell, the conventional cell that we define as a living organism. Then we can see the genetic structure here, or the general structure here is that the virus is formed out of protein and genetic material, whereas our cell has a cell membrane, it has cytoplasm, it has organelles in case of the eukaryotic cells, and it for sure has all of the machinery that the cell needs in order to maintain its metabolism. Then reproduction. Viruses cannot reproduce by themselves. They require a host cell, whereas eukaryotic and prokaryotic organisms can individually reproduce through division. Now you might argue, well, parasites cannot reproduce individually. They do need their host in order to reproduce, and this is a valid argument. So I would like to encourage you to do some research and find arguments for why should we categorize viruses as living organisms. What are the pros for this, and what are the cons for this? So what talks for viruses classifying them as living organisms, and what argues against classifying them as living organisms. Genetic material in viruses, depending on whether it's a retrovirus or not, is either DNA or RNA in case of retroviruses, and usually in other cells it is the genetic material is found in form of DNA. Growth and development is not present in viruses. The virus is assembled within the host cell and then released from the host cell, and it doesn't develop afterwards. We've talked about eukaryotic and prokaryotic organisms and in the general classification of life, that yes, there's development and growth within those organisms. Then obtain and use energy, viruses don't, other cells do. Response to their environment, viruses don't respond to their environment, other cells do respond to their environment. And then do they change over time? And that's the unfortunate thing with viruses from a medical point of view. Yes, they do change over time. So do eukaryotic and prokaryotic organisms, as we've talked with regard to biodiversity. And this is actually a medical problem that viruses change over time, because if you have a vaccination against the virus and this virus changes over time, then the host organism may become vulnerable to these changes and maybe, in spite of vaccination, be affected by this virus again. So there are changes in viruses, but obviously those changes are ultimately created in the host cell that creates this virus, not by the virus itself. If we look at the size of viruses now, here you can see blood cells and bacterial cells, and here you can see how small, if you compare a bacterium to a red blood cell in eukaryotic organisms, you can see the bacterium is already much smaller than the red blood cell here. And what are we talking about, the dimensions? So the scale bar here is 2,500 nanometers or 2.5 micrometers. And if you now look at the virus compared to this bacterium, the size of the virus, they are considerably smaller than even the prokaryotic organisms compared to the eukaryotic organisms. In this case here, that's a smallpox virus. Here's your bacteriophage. And this is the tobacco mosaic virus here. So viruses can look very different and obviously are very specific for the host cell. So they have a very small size viruses. The majority are too small to see with the light microscope, and so electron microscopic methods need to be utilized in order to visualize them. Then they're very tough to grow. You can't grow them like you grow bacteria in those bacterial cultures in the petri dish. They are very specific for their host cells within which they grow. And then they're hard to find because they often have a very narrow range of host individuals. This is why often diseases cannot be transmitted from animals to humans. Obviously there are cases like this which are very dangerous, such as the bird flu or the avian flu that can be transmitted to humans. But in general, there's not, these viruses are very specific for their host cells. So I have a discussion assignment for you, and I open this discussion on Canvas. Do you consider a virus a living organism or not? Bring your arguments and discuss them. So ideally, I would like for you to bring some arguments for classifying viruses as living organisms and some arguments against viruses and their classification as living organisms.